Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a six-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin.
I'd like to welcome you to this edition of the Misquoting Jesus podcast. Today, I will be interviewing Jennifer Knust, who is an expert on Bible translation, along with many other things. This topic is a very interesting topic for a lot of reasons. It's an issue that most people don't even think about much, even though they benefit from it. How do you take the Bible from some other language, translated originally in Greek and Hebrew, and how do you put it into English or into any other modern language? There are over 2 billion Christians in the world, and most of them have some kind of access to the Bible in their language. But how does it happen exactly? And it involves problems with translation just generally. And anybody who translates a book, whether it's Dostoevsky or the Apostle Paul, has problems just involved with taking words in one language and sentences in one language and putting it into another. There are special problems that come up with the Bible in particular for a lot of reasons that we'll be getting into. And so I'll be talking about all that with Jennifer Knust, who is a colleague of mine in crosstown rival Duke University, where she has been a professor of religious studies since 2019 and has been active in the field of biblical research and teaching for a long time. She did her PhD at Columbia University in New York in 2001, and she's written a number of books and a huge number of articles on all sorts of aspects of especially New Testament and early Christian studies. And recently, she has been a member of the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, this new translation, the newest translation that has just come out, that is getting very, very positive reviews. We're not going to talk about that particular translation unless it happens to come up. I'm really more interested here in the general questions about translation and the Bible. So Jenny, welcome.
Thank you, Bart. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So I just want to kind of start with the general thing. I mean, when I was a kid, there are like two translations I knew about. There was the RSV and the King James Version, and now it seems like there are about 26,000. So why do people keep translating the Bible? And do we need all these translations?
Oh, well, I can't speak for others. I mean, I know something about why the New Revised Standard Version decided to be updated, or why the SBL and the National Council of Churches decided to update that. I don't know why
SBL
others do it.
Society of
Biblical Literature, yeah. Sorry, and the National Council of Churches is the NCC. I know why they did it. I know a little bit about why the NIV, the New International Version Committee, did their translation. I know I've taught some Bible history classes, so I've done some historical investigation of why, but I don't know all of the answers to all of them, but you're absolutely right. People love to translate the Bible.
Well, but why? I mean, so I was a research rep for the original NRSV committee for several years toward the end of it. And at that point, I guess they were revising a revision that had been done in 1952. So it was about 30 years later. Mm-hmm. So I guess that kind of makes sense. So what reasons do people have? I mean, why do you need both a New International Version and an NRSV, and why?
Well, you probably should speak about the NRSV. That is so cool that you were part of that original committee in a way, because obviously Metzger was the lead of that, and Metzger was your advisor, if I remember correctly. So of course you were. I think that the New International Version, as I understand it, was a reaction in part to the Revised Standard Version and the decision, among other issues, around how to translate Parthenos.
Parthenos.
I believe so. I believe so.
Yeah,
virgin,
okay.
The word is virgin. And as you know, in Hebrew, the word is alama. And so, he shall send a virgin is the tradition, and the Hebrew counterpart in that RSV is translated as young woman, and that was considered terrible and a scandal.
Okay, wait, now, hold on a second. Let's get into that, because I was going to get into that later, but let's get into it now, because it's going to get to why you need translation. So, but I mean, okay, so you're talking about a passage in the book of Isaiah. So in Isaiah 7, that is important, always important around Christmas time, because a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and that's how it's quoted. And I in the King James version, I don't remember the exact quotation, but Isaiah 7:14 says something that a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. Something like that. And the Revised Standard Version in 1952 translated Isaiah as a young woman shall conceive. And I remember my grandfather went nuts when that came out.
Oh, really?
Oh my God. Yeah. He was a Pentecostal Christian. He's like, oh my God, they have taken the virgin birth out of the Bible. And, but see, it's quoted, as many people on this will know, it's quoted in the New Testament as well.
Yes.
And it seems it's quoted with this word Parthenos, meaning virgin.
Virgin, right.
But so, right. And so people got kind of upset, because now you either if you translate it as virgin in the Hebrew Bible, it's not an accurate translation. But if you don't translate it as virgin, then it sounds like Matthew's not really quoting the Bible correctly, right?
Exactly.
Right? Okay, so the NIV, the New International Version, was partly done in order to kind of correct that kind of change. Exactly. That it's my understanding. I mean, I wasn't on that committee, but my understanding from reading some of the historiography around it, that was why. And as you probably know, the Revised Standard Version was received by President Truman, on the steps of the Capitol building. I think the Capitol building, if that's right. And so there was a big hoopla about it, and the American participation in that translation was really important. And the sort of arrival of American New Testament scholarship in the post-war period, I think, symbolized by that translation, as well as other work on the Greek New Testament that scholars were doing in the United States at that time, and really contributing to New Testament scholarship in a different way in the post-war period. And then people like your grandfather were not happy with those decisions, and they were actually book burning. So the Revised Standard Version was burned in some contexts. People care. There's a lot at stake in terms of how different words are translated, and the kinds of investments people have in certain theological and doctrinal concerns. And so when the Bible changes, it can be shocking for people, especially if they're not trained in the Greek and the Hebrew, and most people aren't. Like, who has time? So most people just read it in English, and why would they have to read the Hebrew and the Greek? Yeah. No, you're right. The RSV was burned, sometimes publicly. And so as you were mentioning, my teacher, my mentor, was Bruce Metzger, who was the chair of the New Revised Standard Version Committee, but he was also on the Revised Standard Version back in the 1940s and 50s. Yeah. And so he had in the office I worked in, there was this metal box that had ashes in it, and he loved showing it to people, because it was ashes from a North Carolina pastor who had taken a blowtorch to the RSV in the 1950s, and had sent the ashes to the chair of the committee. And so Metzger would show off this thing of ashes, and he'd always say that he's just glad that in the modern world they burn a copy of the translation rather than the translator.
That's funny, actually, and great story. Wow.
So different committees then. So you have committees translating these things. Is that generally the way it works?
I mean, those are the New Testaments that I read, the ones that are translated by committee. There are some individuals who have made individual translations, and I can understand why they might want to do that, because, as even myself, if I'm reading from the Greek, I'm not necessarily going to follow any of the translations in my own thinking around, I actually think this is what, this writer is trying to say, or this book is maybe better translated as this way, because I read Greek. But the committee, these committees are responsible not only to themselves and their own sensibility about, I think this means that, but also to a broader set of institutional contexts. And so the committee translations are representative of institutions, it seems to me.
Okay. So we do have, I guess we do have some translations by individuals, people who just sit down and probably a lot of New Testament scholars get asked by their students, why don't you do one? The idea, you're just kind of, which you could do, obviously. Yeah. But so what do you think it's a better idea to do it by yourself? You say committees have institutions behind them, and it's not clear, is that a good thing or not a good thing?
No, I think it's good, but I think it should be recognized by the readers, right? Okay. So I think sometimes people don't bother to read the prefaces to their translations. And so if they're not reading the preface, they're not understanding historical context within which that translation was made. And every translation is a sort of encapsulation of the priorities of the people involved at that time, which are in turn set in a context, and that context will inform choices that are made. And people should know that choices are made, and that these are not just, word for word translations. I mean, that's impossible anyway, because
okay, well, I definitely want to get to that about why it's impossible. Yeah. But I'm interested in the committee idea, because it seems like on one level, if you've got an individual doing it, you could get kind of their individual genius about it, right? Like in a particular take. But on the other hand, you get all their idiosyncrasies, right? Yeah. Like they've got weird views about this, that, or the other, because everyone does, and that gets into the translation then. But if you have a committee, I mean, it sounds like like novels are not written by committees usually, and so like it must be. How do they do it? I mean, in other words, suppose you. Is a group in a room, like the committee in a room, and they're all deciding how to translate this particular verse?
Well, maybe I could speak about my own experience on the NRSV updated edition. So that was done via Zoom, because it was a lot of it was done during COVID, right? But my understanding is that in the old days, they really were men sitting together in a room making these decisions. But in my case, we met as an editorial board online, because that was the COVID days. So the way it worked with us is the individual book editors. So I was one of the general editors of the New Testament with Mike Holmes, my counterpart. And we together identified and invited book editors who were known experts on the books that we invited them to offer suggestions about. And then the book editor would submit comments and suggested changes. And then as individual general editors, we would go through that, and we would be responsible for doing a first pass of, accept this change, reject that change, discuss this change based on our mandate. And then we would get together as an editorial board to discuss. So the thing that I appreciated about that process is that to translate the Bible is an extremely serious activity that should be done very carefully, because people who don't have access to the original languages should not be misled by the translator to the degree possible. It seems that, or as we put it, we had our slogan, which comes way back. I think the RSV had the slogan too. I want to get it right. As literal as possible, as free as necessary. I think that whatever that means. That
was a Metzger. Metzger came up with that. And that's how they did the RSV. So you've got a group of people on Zoom. Or you're right. I mean, usually it used to be in a room, and maybe it won't be in rooms anymore. But presumably not everybody agrees on what like how to translate a word or how to translate a verse. So what happens when there's a disagreement?
Well, we discuss it and weigh various options, and we actually would reach a consensus based on as a member of a committee, we don't always get our way, right? We have to be sensitive to the various concerns and reach a consensus that may or may not be representative of any individual point of view. Yeah.
But a consensus, usually the term consensus means that everybody agrees. And I can't imagine Bible translators, everybody in a room or on a Zoom agreeing. So does it come down to a majority vote?
I'm trying to remember an instance when I don't think we ever had a contentious vote about anything. I think we would come to an agreement that for all different sorts of reasons, this is what it had to be. I mean, I mean, I guess let me give you an example that I found personally difficult. And I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for the board. I'm speaking for myself.
Yeah.
As you know, one of the most difficult words to translate in the New Testament is the word doulos and its related terms. So the word doulos means slave. And, those of us who are historians of that era know that a third of the population of the Roman Empire was enslaved. And while enslaved persons had all different kinds of jobs, so one could be, for example, a slave of the imperial household and be quite well off, in fact, better than most people in a given city if you were managing the emperor's accounts in, Aphrodisias or something. Most slaves, probably the vast majority, were not, lived terribly abject circumstances where masters could make decisions about their bodies in all different kinds of ways. Okay, so that's our background as people who work on the New Testament and who've been thinking about this problem of slavery or enslaved persons in the New Testament for a long time. And there's so much really great work on this question. And as you know, this is a particularly live question in the United States, where we have a history of slavery, right? Where and the use of the Bible to defend slavery in our own context. So it's a very difficult question. So what do you do about the translation of this term? Well, often what has been done is that in some cases the word is translated slave, and in some cases the word is translated servant. When people might be offended. Like, for example, Paul calls himself slave of Christ. And normally or often the NRSV and the RSV do this, translate this as servant. Paul, servant of Christ. And even in the Magnificat, when Mary says, handmaid, I think is a KJV, what she's actually saying is female slave. Yeah. So the book editors, I think, pretty much universally recommended that anytime that the word doulos is translated servant, it be translated as slave.
This is the NRSV.
The NRSV updated edition. The NRSV, the old NRSV follows the rule of having Paul servant, for example. Huh. The updated edition, the initial discussion was we should just be consistent and use the word slave.
Okay.
Or enslaved person in cases where it's clear that, like, for example, Paul, slave of God, Paul's declaring himself to be slave. But in other cases, if we're talking about slaves, let's use enslaved, because those people aren't choosing to be slaves, right? It's not like they're like, yay, let me be a slave. So like enslaved person in that case. That was kind of the consensus of the editorial board. But it went back to the National Council of Churches, and there was a huge debate about it because it was really offensive, actually, to many of the member churches in the National Council of Churches, including historically Black congregations, who felt really like, no, they don't want to, that's not the same to say when Paul calls himself slave of God, that's not the same, right? He's not declaring that he wants to be enslaved by God. And we don't want to do anything that gives the impression that God wants humanity to be enslaved, would have been, that argument.
Yes. And
so ultimately the National Council of Churches is the copyright holder for the New Revised Standard Version, and now the New Revised Standard Version updated edition. And so they're the ones who make the final decisions about what's in the text. And so what ended up happening is that even though initially the editorial board of scholars, right, had recommended translating doulos as slave or slave language in every case, what ended up happening is that when the term is being used to describe a person, who's accepting that role, servant language continued to be employed. So I myself, as a scholar, would prefer that doulos be consistently translated as slave throughout, or enslaved, because my sense as a scholar and, when I'm teaching, is that I want students to wrestle with what it means to have a text that's produced in a slaveholding context, and what it means, the history of the use of those texts, even in the United States, and how to wrestle with scripture as an authority that's used even in something as abhorrent as slavery. So that's, as a scholar, that's what I prefer. But because these texts are not only used in classrooms and they're used in churches, the decision of the National Council of Churches was no, we're not going to do that. We'll put in footnote. So you'll notice that there'll be a footnote, Greek, slave, but the word is sometimes continues to be translated as servant. And so there's an instance where, and again, I didn't agree with that, but we didn't vote. I'm like, okay, I accept I accept that decision. Like, I understand the logic of that decision, even though it's not my preference.
Yes.
So we didn't ask people to vote. It was more like, okay, that the reasoning there is legitimate. And
so there's a different Greek word for servant.
Correct.
And that's translated as servant.
Correct.
And is doulos ever translated as slave in the updated edition?
Yes. When in instances where, like in the slave parables in the Gospels, right, where there's slaves, or in instances when Paul or the Pauline epistles, or First Peter talking about enslaved persons and how slaves should behave, and like the household codes. These are translated with the word slave, which is appropriate because slaves in particular are being addressed. So there's lots of examples where doulos and doulos related words are translated as slave.
I see. Yeah, but it's the consistency. That's one of the hard things, I think, for translations is just generally whether. Yeah. I mean, this is obviously a very sticky situation for religious reasons, church reasons, and so it's a very difficult issue.
Yes.
But even when you're just translating anything, I mean, the question is, do you slavishly follow a particular translation? In other words, this is how I've translated this word in this chapter. Do I translate the word the same way in this other chapter in a different context or not? Right. It's always kind of.
Right,
tricky.
because maybe a different book has a different nuance to that term.
Yes.
Right, because we have these are 27 books by different people by and large, not only, but so they might use a word differently. Each have.
But even if you're translating, a French novel, I mean, you still have to decide. It's not that you translate the word the same way every time. You
exactly.
have to, you vary it depending because the new. So could you just say something about that? I mean, it sounds like that's a great illustration of how the nuances of a language are very difficult to translate. I mean, you could just say, this word means that, this word means this, and just like then you just feed it into a computer, right? Say what the word means, and the computer will chunk out a translation. But like, it doesn't work that way, right? Definitely
not. No, definitely not. You have to make decisions because the languages are different. I have so many examples, but maybe an easy one for the NRSV update would be the word adelphoi, which means brothers.
Yes.
Or siblings. Siblings would probably be a better translation, although we don't use that word enough in English, but siblings maybe is the way to go with adelphoi, right?
Yeah, but siblings doesn't have a counterpart. Adelphoi does have one with adelphoi.
Well, exactly. But the problem with adelphoi, of course, because Greek is a gendered language. And so if you have adelphoi, you could well mean siblings where there are brothers and sisters present. And you cannot tell because if you have a room of, 10 siblings and one is a sister and 9 are brothers, the word is still going to be masculine, adelphoi, right? Or
so everybody understands this. In Greek, the noun actually indicates whether it's a masculine noun or a feminine noun. And masculine nouns are usually used for male things, and feminine for female, but also just every word. Bookcase has a noun, and it might be masculine or feminine. It's got nothing to do with whether the bookcase is male or female. But so with something like adelphoi, when you're dealing with humans, you're saying that sometimes it means brothers, and sometimes it just means like brothers and sisters.
Exactly. Okay. And there's really no way to tell if there are, sisters in mind, right? Like there's no way to actually tell. But back in the day when the NRSV was translated, and we wish we had Metzger here to explain this to us, the decision was made to use inclusive language whenever possible and whenever likely. Likely there were women there, so sisters, right? Because often this term brothers would be employed to talk about members of the Jesus movement.
Yes.
Right. And so we know women were there. This is not a mystery, right? We know there's lots of named women in the New Testament. So we know there's women there. So they're brothers and sisters, right?
Yeah.
And so in the NRSV, when that decision was made to make sure to include sisters, not only to say brothers, there was not consistency around how individual book editors decided to handle that gendered issue, right? So sometimes I think believers was a translation that was used sometimes, or other words besides brothers and sisters. And because one of the goals of the update was to sort of update the English in an appropriate way. We didn't mess with the original mandate of the NRSV, but we did decide to translate Adelphoi as brothers and sisters consistently. So if the NRSV had believers for Adelphoi, we translated it as brothers and sisters. So that goes to your consistency point.
Yes.
And in that case, we decided that brothers and sisters was a better way of representing the way that the addressees were being addressed by the writer,
Yeah. If you're interested in the Gospels of the New Testament, the book of Genesis, the resurrection of Jesus, the historicity of the Exodus, or anything else connected with the Bible, you should check out my online courses, where I cover all these topics and more. If you'd like to learn about the courses, check them out at barterman.com. You can receive a discount on any of your purchases simply by entering the code MJPodcast. Yeah, actually, when I was hired by the NRSV committee, one of my mandates was to work on the inclusive language issue. And so and it was an interesting thing with the NRSV because when the work started, they didn't have a mandate about inclusive language, and that came in only after a while. And it was really interesting to see these. I wasn't one of the translators; I was the research grunt, but I had to kind of go through and deal with consistency issues, but especially with inclusive language. And it was interesting to see how they evolved over time, because at first, a lot of the traditionalists thought, you just can't, you can't do this inclusively and get the words right. You just can't say, and so how do you, they weren't going to say he or she, and they weren't going to, they weren't going to invent a pronoun. And so but it was interesting because over time they started realizing there actually are ways to do this that are intelligible and not bad English, and so they got better and better. Metzger in particular got really pretty good at it, but it did mean that there were these places where, I think they just decided that they were going to make it inclusive when it was referring to humans, when it was inclusive when there were men and women both involved, but they weren't going to be wooden in how they did it. Some places might be, they thought, the believers thing doesn't work too well, but they did make some good decisions. But okay, so that's interesting. So everywhere, is their idea was that, like, if Paul's writing a letter to Thessalonica or something, and he says Adelphoi, that he's not just talking to the men, and so they'll translate it brothers and sisters. But there were other places, like where in the book of Acts, where somebody would be talking to a group of men that they
like men, brothers, and that's like traditional Greek address,
brothers,
right?
And so did you all change that as well?
I can't remember. I didn't check before this conversation. I can't remember what we ended up deciding to do. We talked about it. We talked about how that's formal Greek address. In cases like that, we might have put in notes. I don't remember. I'd have to go look at individual cases.
Yeah. So, translations often do have notes. Are you a big fan of translation notes? And do you think like there should be? Because my experience is that most students, at least, don't look at them.
Yeah.
So, do you have a view about notes?
For this purpose, I think yes. I think it was important to put them in because we're trying to be as transparent as possible about what the decisions were and why they were that, and that there were other alternatives. And I'm happy that we did that. I think that was the right thing. I can see the wisdom of having a translation that's bare of notes, but in this case, I think, given the aspiration of the NRSV and the NRSV update, and I think the RSV as well back in the day, to speak to an academic as well as confessional audience, it makes sense to have that information available so that people who are studying only the English can see the work. Yeah.
The other thing I'll say is that with the NRSV, they really did take votes on every issue. I was a secretary for a few years before I was hired, and I was like, I'd sat in the room I was dealing with the Old Testament, and they'd have 6 people in the room, and they always wanted to have 7 or 5 because if they actually vote and it's like would win by 1 vote, okay, we'll do it that way. And
interesting.
Yeah, every word basically they vote. Oh, they discuss it, and then they take a vote. It's like, oh my God, it's 3-2. Okay, that's what it is then.
So interesting. Yeah, we didn't do that. I mean, I guess I did feel like we did have votes in the sense that, we had the opportunity to state our opinion. And if we could persuade the group, then we won, but we didn't take formal votes.
Well, you had a much more amenable committee than they did for the original NRSV. You all are very agreeable. So you mentioned something a minute ago, and you mentioned several times about people, who just read the English. And the New Testament is, of course, written in Greek. And so can you just say something about like how when you're doing a translation, whether not just the NRSV updated edition, but just kind of generally when somebody's translating the New Testament, a lot of people, I think most people will know who are listening to this, that we don't have the original New Testament. We don't, when whoever wrote the Gospel of John, we don't have that thing that he wrote. We have copies from many years later, and these copies are all different from each other. So, I mean, how do translators decide which? So if you got 700 copies of this particular book, and there are like differences all over the place, which manuscript do you translate?
Well, the RSV and the NRSV and the come out of a tradition of using European and North American textual criticism and the insights of textual criticism in order to make decisions about what the underlying text should be. So the underlying textual
criticism, because I think some people will think that means like interpreting text.
So right, well, you're free to help me do this, but so
don't let her say that, you all audience, because she's an expert in this.
Well, I'm trying to think how to say it. I mean, you're better at this kind of, explaining. But so the idea is you have, thousands of manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, and you have to make a decision about, well, what text will we print as the guiding text, right? I'm going to use that word. So people have decided differently about what that guiding text, that text that's printed in if you open up an edition, what the main text is.
You're talking about the Greek, the Greek edition of the Greek New Testament.
The edition of the Greek New Testament. And what textual critics do is debate the method and the rules for how to develop that text that ought to be printed as the text from which we might do our translation. Okay. And then textual critics, usually like the English translators, try to show their work through something called a critical apparatus that shows what they didn't decide to put in the main text. Okay. So the RSV and the NRSV and also the NIV, although that's a little bit different story, follow the tradition of employing New Testament textual criticism, that art of or science of putting, deciding what the text is and then showing your work as the base text for the translations that are made. And so one of the reasons why the Revised Standard Version was made is because there had been so many advances in the ways in which scholars who do work with the manuscripts understood what the text should be. And similarly, with the new Revised Standard Version, Bruce Metzger, as you know, was himself a very important, famous text critic. And there had been advances or changes, maybe would be a better way of saying it. New Testament textual critics might want to say advances, but progress or something. But there have been changes in understanding of what the best text ought to be. So in Metzger's generation of New Testament textual critics, the goal was to find the original text, the text as the author of individual New Testament books had written it down, and to try to figure that out based on comparing, various manuscripts and using criteria and methods to understand what the original text was. Mm. And nowadays, people talk about something called the initial text. What was the text, the Greek text that from which all the other manuscript evidence can be explained? It's incredibly complicated. There's we could take an entire podcast and we still wouldn't understand what the heck they're talking about. And
Okay, so all right, but when your committee or any committee, so we don't, but just when a committee of translators sits down, they're not like deciding on the Greek text for Matthew chapter 1 verse 1, right? They've got an edition in front of them they've got something in front of them they're actually translating.
Yes.
Is that right? they're
Yes,
not
that's
going
right.
to the
So
scratch,
the mandate of the NRSV updated edition was actually to use the most recent text critical editions.
Okay.
So that would be, for our purposes, the one that's produced in Germany is the Nestle Aland 28, or in the United States would be the UBS, United Bible Society 5th edition, I believe. And then in this other work that's been going on called the Editio Critica Maior, which is this massive project that's being undertaken in Germany, where all the texts of all of the books of the New Testament over time are being gradually reconsidered, and they haven't all been finished. So book editors who had all of that information available were sort of their part of their mandate was to review that. And also Mike Holmes, the general editor that I worked with, had produced his own critical edition, the SBL Greek New Testament, and that was also to be consulted. So decisions were to be made. Text critical decisions were made by individual book editors, and then we as general editors would look at that. And, one of the reasons why I was, I think, asked to be one of the general editors is, although I do not and never will produce a critical edition of the New Testament, I know how the textual critics who are working today, how they do their work. And so I was able to tell, make suggestions.
So, I mean, the basic, for the basic line is somebody can go online and buy a Greek New Testament, and almost everybody's going to get a Greek New Testament that's pretty similar to every other Greek New Testament. There'll be some differences, but where there are important differences, the committee has to decide which Greek version do I follow, which Greek text do I follow here, and different committees might decide different things. Like they might.
Exactly.
So there are some famous instances where most translation committees are going to agree that, those verses were not originally in there, even though they're in the King James.
Yes.
And there are other times where text critics can't decide. Well, in Luke 22, when it says that Jesus was in deep agony before his being arrested, and he's sweating great drops as if of blood. So it's a sweating blood passage. Some manuscripts have that, and some don't have it. And so a translation committee just has to decide which side do we think is right.
Exactly.
And then translate it or not. And maybe have a footnote. Do they put footnotes for that kind of thing?
Yes. So when there were something like a split decision in among the textual critics who are operating in this particular framework of like European and North American modernist textual criticism, when there was split decisions among the text critics around something, then yes, you'll see something like other manuscripts or other, I forget how we had it. We had a special set of words that we would use that indicate that there's different readings in different manuscripts. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So you're translating this Greek. So, and all right. So are there places where like the Greek is where the grammar is debate? You were talking about the word doulos, and we can talk about more words because there are a lot more words that are problematic. But are there also grammatical issues are there places where the grammar could be interpreted in a variety of ways? So there must be issues about punctuation, right? Because Greek manuscripts don't have punctuation, and you got to decide how to punctuate something. And so So, okay. Could you just say something about grammar?
So one that comes to mind, it's kind of a grammar question and kind of a translation question mixed together, is that famous line in 1 Corinthians 7 where Paul says, hold on, let me look at my notes because I don't want to mess this up.
Okay.
I took notes on this one because I thought you might ask me this question. So where's my 1 Corinthians 7 slate thing? Darn it. See, I should have looked this up. You can edit this part out, right? The boring news here. This part can go away. Where'd it go? I put it in here. You know the one in 1 Corinthians where Paul's like, oh, here we go. There it is. 1 Corinthians. Okay. Back into the world. 1 Corinthians 7:21, right? Where there's the Greek is incredibly ambiguous. What does Paul mean when he says malon kresai, right? Rather make use of it. Is that what he means? This is the part, were you a slave when called? Don't be concerned about it. Even if you can gain your freedom, make use of your present condition now more than ever. That was the old NRSV.
That's Paul talking to people in Corinth who are slaves? People in
Corinth who are slaves.
Okay.
And he's saying to them something, either he's saying, if you're a slave, bummer for you, but make good use of your present condition?
Okay.
Or is he saying something like, Malon Cressai, make use of your opportunity to obtain freedom? What is his nuance here? Yeah. So the old NRSV has make use of your present condition. The book editor came back and said, let's leave this as a minimum translation, and recommended that we don't use, that we say something like rather use it, right? If you can gain your freedom, rather use it, or something. So that was the book editor's recommendation. And so we sort of talked about that as a board because it was awkward English. And we said, well, maybe we could say, this was the board's discussion, but even if it is possible to become free, rather do so with a note, meaning of Greek uncertain. That was a recommendation. Okay. So what we submitted to the National Council of Churches was, were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. But even if it is possible to become free, rather do so. That was what we ended up going with. And then what's in the actual translation is, were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. Even if you can gain your freedom, make the most of it. So that was the National Council of Churches decision. I wasn't part of that. But there's still a footnote that says meaning of Greek uncertain. So here we have a kind of ambiguous Greek. I mean, and grammar can't really save it for us, right? But it actually really matters. Is Paul recommending that slaves try to gain their freedom, or is Paul recommending that they don't try to gain their freedom and just, make the best of it and try to show that in fact they're not enslaved anymore, because spiritually they're not enslaved. They're slaves. They're slaves of Christ. So that means they're not enslaved to human masters.
But
from Paul's
it sounds like you're saying that the final decision is made by people who are not experts in Greek or in translation.
Well, the people in the National Council of Churches who made that decision do read Greek. So the National Council of Churches representative on our committee was Abraham Smith, who's a fantastic scholar, as you know, who teaches at Perkins. And so presumably he was part of that discussion. And I don't know, somewhere there's notes about why that decision was made. But it's not outside of what the board had discussed, right? Like what their decision, make the most of it, is not that different from.
But it doesn't sound like it's being decided on academic grounds. In other words, it's not like people who are really wrestling with what an ancient language means. It's people who are concerned that the translation not be used in a bad way or understood in a bad way, and so it sounds like there are issues outside of linguistic scholarship that are determining how the translation gets done. Is that fair to say?
That's true, which is why people should read the preface to their translations, right? Because I don't
understand what it means.
But I'm not sure that people don't realize, or our students probably don't realize that all of these translations. I don't know of a translation, maybe an individual translation, but every translation has some kind of confessional Christian involvement in it, to my knowledge, of the New Testament. So that's going to make a difference in terms of how the translation takes place.
You mentioned the New International Version earlier, and it's the most popular English translation. It has been for many, many years, and it reads very well. It reads well. It's a good translation that way. But the committee members, if I understand correctly, I think I do understand correctly, were all evangelical Christians and had to have an evangelical commitment to the inspiration of the Bible.
Right.
And there are places where they simply translate away contradictions. I mean, there are contradictions that they just, the way they translate it, it's no longer a contradiction. And so you can't even, if you're reading that, you can't even tell that there's a problem. So I'll have students in class and I'll be pointing out, this verse, that verse, the difference this book, and they'll say, I don't see that. Look, I said, what translation? I'm using the NIV. It's a great translation in this way, but I guess it's really not different. You're saying it's not different. We all have institutional boundaries, or translators have institutional boundaries, and that affects things. Unlike say a translation of Homer. Where
exactly. And a translation of something like Homer has to be attentive not only to sort of ease of reading and how we could teach that text or whatever, but to a bunch of scholars who are going to yell at you if you don't get your.
Well, that's right. It's still institutional. That's right.
So, But, with the New Testament, it's not only a bunch of scholars who are going to yell, and I'm sure, or not yell, maybe be annoyed or, critical or whatever. And I'm sure there will be criticism of this translation, and I welcome that. I mean, I think that's appropriate, actually, because like I said, there's things that as a scholar, I probably wouldn't have chosen that, this translation or that translation. But that's appropriate. And there will also be critics on the confessional Christian side. There will be other Christians who don't like this or that. And it's hard to bring all these interests together into a single translation. I mean, it's impossible, really.
So can you, let's go back to kind of on a more kind of technical level about translating Greek into English. It's got to be somewhat different from translating, French or Russian, because those are living languages, and we have trillions of books and articles and things written in these languages.
Yes.
But so with Greek, can you tell us just on the very basic level, Greek is still a spoken language, but the spoken language today, it just ain't like it was 2,000 years ago.
Sure.
And so how do you even know what words meant 2,000 years ago? Talking about in the very basic, like, how do you know what a word means?
Well, I think you have to just read a lot of Greek, and not only New Testament, right? You have to read all the Greek that you can get your hands on, from Homer all the way to, the 13th century. If you can. We have something called the Thesaurus Linguae Graeca, which is a giant digital compendium of all Greek literature from its earliest, extant moment up until, I think they're in the 16th century now. So if we could read all of that Greek, then we would have a chance. No, I think that the more
most people would say you just look it up in a dictionary, right? But how did the people make the dictionary know what the words mean?
They read a lot of Greek. Exactly.
But you can't read the Greek if you don't know what the words mean. So what?
Right.
So how's it work?
Well, they're also, if they're English speakers, for example, then they're also being trained by other English speakers what these words mean. So I think that the way we all start, at least I'll speak for myself, I started learning Greek was I had my Greek professor teaching me how to translate certain words. I think we all learned, at least what I did, I learned luo, to loose is the base, the base way of interpreting or sort of learning all of the verbal forms. And so nobody told me that, to loose could also mean to set free or whatever. And I had to learn that over time through encountering the word in context. So initially you learn some kind of, obvious meaning. And then you have to learn, you see the word happening. And then you're like, oh, wait a minute, that's not quite what this means, or it means it, but it means it with a different nuance. So like to loose might mean to set free if it's in the right context.
Yeah. Okay. So the idea is then you get a basic meaning, but then, so if you get the word hodos, which means like a way, a road or a path, and then you're reading it, you realize when you read it enough, it doesn't mean dandelion, or it doesn't mean ship. I mean, because it doesn't make sense. And so you see that makes sense with this context. But eventually you'll come to a context, you say, wait, that doesn't really sound that, the road or path doesn't really work here, but it means something kind of really. And so that's how they come up, by reading everything in context, I guess. So
exactly.
What happens with words, some of which you get in the New Testament, for which there is no other usage? In other words, a word is made. So the technical term, for those of you into technical terms, those are called hapax legomena.
Isn't that a great thing to call? That's a great term in English. Like hapax legomena is like such an awesome word. Everyone should learn that word.
They should. And I tell my students, you need to learn words like this so your parents will be able to justify their tuition costs. Learn hapax legomena. Okay, so you come across, and a singular for that is a hapax legomenon. And so when you come across a hapax legomena in anywhere, but in the New Testament there are a few. I mean, how do you know how to translate it if there's no context, right? Somebody's told you what it means, but maybe they're wrong. How do they know? So how do you know?
Well, you just read all the debates and then you make a decision. The example that sticks in my mind, it is a hapax legomena, because it's a hapax legomenon that ends up being a hapax legomena, is the word arsenikotoi, which means is some kind of hybrid of the word man beds, right? So it's like the word man, arsen, plus beds. The word for bed, man and beds mushed together into a word.
Where does this first occur?
It first occurs in 1 Corinthians. Paul. It first occurs in a writing of Paul. That's the first known usage of this word in the Greek language. Now, that doesn't mean it didn't exist somewhere else. It just means it didn't occur. It doesn't appear in extant literature, right? So we don't know if it was being used in
This is the passage where Paul is going through a list of people who will not inherit the kingdom of heaven.
Exactly.
One of the people that won't be our man beds.
Exactly. I mean, whatever the heck that means, right? And people have made all kinds of different arguments about what it might mean. You know, maybe it means it's some kind of illicit sex between men. Maybe it's about some kind of exploitative sex between men. I mean, it could mean many different things. And there's no way to know. There is no way to know, because it first occurs in this context as in a list of vices. And frankly, lists of vices are not usually offered in order to be specific about the activity. I mean, that's true.
Right.
That's true in our own context. If we're going to slur someone, you know, we're not like thinking about the exact activity. What we're doing is trying to use words that are mean to stick to somebody.
Well, that's right. And so we know it's something mean because it's in this list of vices, and people who like do whatever these man beds are doing is bad. This is the word that gets sometimes gets translated and understood as homosexual. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. That's correct.
And so people just assume it means homosexual, but in fact, it could, you know, maybe, but not really even maybe. I mean, I think you and I.
No, I say no. It definitely doesn't mean that.
It absolutely cannot mean homosexual.
Absolutely cannot mean that. Yeah. Right. It absolutely does not mean that. And it occurs
for reason other than man beds. I mean, it has to do with, in the ancient world, like the term homosexual would have made no sense to anybody. I mean, there wouldn't be a concept.
There was no category of a person who ontologically, you know, desired men. That like wasn't a thing. So like that doesn't exist as a concept.
There were men who did desire men, but there wasn't a concept that this kind of phenomenon exists. So they didn't have a sense of sexuality, orientation, or anything like that to even allow for
desire was not understood the same way.
Yeah, right.
Completely on board with you. We are totally in agreement on this point. And,
So, but when you come across a word like that, you just take your best guess. I mean, you got to use another word, right? I would translate. I'll tell you my biggest problem in translation, Jenny, was when I was trying to translate the Apostolic Fathers, and I'd come across a word, and I was used to doing this with a group of PhD students, and you'd say, well, it could mean this, could mean that, could be that, and you kind of come up with a bunch of things. But then when you're doing translation, you got to type a word, right? Yeah. And you can't say it could mean this, and that, and that. So how do you just take a good guess?
No, I mean, what we ended up doing, and I felt that was this agreed with me. I agree with myself. This decision was that we ended up deciding as a board to translate that word as men who have illicit sex. Footnote, meaning of Greek uncertain, for exactly this reason. Yeah. We know Paul's saying something mean. Yeah. And we know he's saying something mean about men. Yeah. But beyond that, we don't know.
Men in bed. Something involving men
who are in beds doing something, but what we don't know.
I think it's actually a pretty good decision.
I thought so too. I was happy with that. I do. I thought that was a good decision. And what we didn't like, and I think rightly so, was what the NRSV had.
What did they have?
They had sodomites.
No, the NRSV did?
They did. I mean, it's shockingly bad because it's anachronistic. It's so bad that it's like, it makes me cringe. I don't care what your perspective is. It's so bad. It's the worst translation and so bad. And so we got rid of that and tried to be as clear as possible that this is really an uncertain word because it is a hapax legomenon.
And let me just say, now that you told me that, I just want everybody to know I had nothing to do with the NRSV. Sodomites. Whoa. All right. Yeah. Well, we could have a whole thing about why that's bad because it's on a lot of different levels. So
I have a thing in Bible Odyssey. I had to write a thing about it in Bible Odyssey because we got in a lot of trouble for translating this as men who have illicit sex, footnote, meaning of Greek uncertain. Like really? when the initial release happened, a bunch of people wrote the NRSV update edition board and protested that decision. And so I wrote something about this is why.
Bible Odyssey is this online thing sponsored by the Society of Biblical Literature that people can just Google Bible Odyssey. They have articles on stuff like this and they could.
Exactly. And so I wrote the one about man beds.
Man beds. Okay. Yeah. Good. Did these people who protested have an alternative that they were suggesting, or were they just didn't like your
they thought we weren't mean enough. They wanted us to be meaner in our translation.
Go after some specific group they didn't like.
Exactly. Like they don't like this group, so let's go after them. I'm like, okay, that's a good reason to translate something the right way so you can be mean. Yeah, right, exactly.
But I want to end just with a final question. There are people in our world today who still think that the King James Version is the best translation, and they don't see any reason to read newer translations. And I don't need anything specific about the NRSV or anything, just kind of generally. Is there a problem with just reading the King James, or is there a reason to read something that's a recent translation? Or is there a reason to read? I mean, yeah. So just generally in your view.
So I think I like to read the King James Version. I think the King James Version is a beautiful translation. It's the one that my grandmother knew, and so it reminds me of my grandma. And I have no problem. I have no objection to reading the King James Version. My objection would be to thinking that the King James Version is an accurate translation of exactly what God said. I mean, that doesn't make sense, because the King James Version, like every translation, comes out of a historical context. It uses this archaizing English from our perspective, right? So the English has changed, just like Greek changed. English changed, and King James's English is not the English we use in the United States in 2022, and so it offers a misimpression of the language that's used in the New Testament, which is not an elevated language by and large, right? So it sounds to us, when we hear thy and thou and thee and whatever, that like we're talking in some kind of, we're pretending to be Shakespeare or something, I don't know, and so it makes us think that the New Testament's in this elevated language, but it's not. It's written in a very kind of coarse Greek by and large. And so it's a misimpression if that's all we're reading. So that's that. And then it also, I don't know. I mean, it also uses a Greek text that most scholars would not accept as the best Greek text at this point. It is a Greek text, that was an important Greek text for Protestants. As that text came forward in the invention of the printing press through the Protestant Reformation, that became the Protestant text. It's called the Textus Receptus, or the received text. And that's the Greek text that's behind the King James Version. So it is a historically valid Protestant text behind the King James Version, but it's not the Greek text that one would find in a critically edited New Testament that we use today.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, to the extent there are actually some important verses that are in the King James, because it was in the Greek text they're translating, that today most scholars say, those weren't originally there, and so
exactly.
But also, and at a deeper level too, other than just verses here and there. So, okay. Well, that's really helpful. It's nice to have somebody who's been recently involved with this entire process to tell us about it, because it really is a complicated thing, and it's more. It
was such a privilege. I just want to make that clear. Like, it was complicated, and not every decision went my way, but it was such a privilege to be part of that committee. I mean, and to listen to the book editors, and to listen to the other members of the committee, and to try to be as responsible as possible to all of these various constituencies who care so deeply about these texts. It was an incredible experience, and I feel so lucky that I was part of it. I just want to say that. And really hats off to Mike Holmes, who was the other general editor, and to all the book editors who did such beautiful work. And frankly, they can't be thrilled because a lot of the stuff they recommended didn't happen. So I hope they'll all yell at us, because they all made great suggestions that we couldn't incorporate in the end for all kinds of reasons. So it was a great experience.
Well, I'm glad. And it's, and it's important work. The National Council of Churches is the one who owns the copyright to this.
Exactly.
I mean, we're talking about the largest collection of Christian churches in America, and it's an entire group. And so this is the translation that they officially endorse and fund, but they endorse it. And so it makes a big difference when you're on that committee, because you're influencing how people understand the Bible. And that's
which is a huge responsibility, And I mean, Bart, you do this professionally too, right? You want to be as fair and accurate and just as possible in how you represent what you're reading and why you're making the decisions that you're making, and you do the best you can. But we're human. I mean, I think that's one of the things to remember when we're reading any translation, is that human beings made these translations, in all of our situatedness and imperfection, and yet also our sincere effort to be responsible to the jobs that we've been entrusted to undertake.
Yeah. Well, that's a great way to end it. So thanks, Jenny. I really appreciate it. And
thanks, Bart.
So it's been really great. Okay, so good luck, and I suggest not taking on a translation project anytime soon. It's too much work.
I definitely am not going to. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for listening in, and we will have another very interesting episode soon as well, next week. Okay. Thanks a lot.
This has been an episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please be sure to subscribe to our show for free on your favorite podcast listening app or on Bart Ehrman's YouTube channel so you don't miss out. From Bart Ehrman and myself, Megan Lewis, thank you for joining us.